I am so excited about today's topic because it's fantastic for leadership, for professional communication, but also for daily life. So, this is something that's going to really help you. And in particular, it's going to help you understand the cultural differences. So, I'll try to share with you some stories of different clients and their experiences because the country that you're from and the way that you communicate in your native language really impacts conversation and small talk in English, especially with American cultural nuance. And as usual, make sure you remember to go to tanyasuarez.com/lead to download my free audio training about the 3 essentials of American leadership communication. Now, what we're going to talk about today is changing the subject. So today you're going to learn how to change the subject smoothly. Now, you're probably having one of two reactions. Either the first one of like, I do this all the time, I'm fine. Or, oh, yes, I don't know how to change the subject and I always feel stuck in the conversation. So, this is really helpful because if you're in the first category, I guarantee you might not be doing it as smoothly as you think you are. And I hope that I'm wrong. But in my experience, there are cultural differences and there are things that yes, you're changing the subject, but if you don't do it in the way that we're going to talk about today, it's probably coming across, you're probably making the wrong impression. And you'll see what I mean as we go along. So, this is really important for you to understand that it's not just about changing the subject, it's about navigating conversations with Americans smoothly in a way that reflects respect and keeps the conversation going. Because when you're at this level of English, it's not just about the logistics anymore. It's really about connection. Okay, the first thing we want to do, let me put this full screen. Oh, massage your ears. I call this method 3, 2, 1. So 3 and then 2. You're going to go up 1, down 2, and then 1 breath. I do this in all of my sessions. It's incredibly helpful because what you're doing is you're connecting English training, speaking English with calm confidence. And this has an amazing impact when you start feeling that calm confidence get activated naturally because you've now trained your body. When I speak English, my body feels good. All right. So, the first tip I want you to know when you're changing the subject, before I tell you how to do it, I have to remind you to engage in active listening. And there are certain ways that you might be doing this appropriately and some that are coming across as aggressive. And what I mean by that is when you want to change the subject, first and foremost, it means you're having other ideas in your mind, right? Something pops up that you want to share and you want to change the subject of the conversation. Oftentimes, what happens as a non native speaker is you start planning how you're going to talk about it, which means you stop listening actively. And you might think, well, I mean, like they're not going to notice, but it does make a difference. When you're thinking, and you're not listening actively, your eyes kind of lose their sparkle, right? That glazed over look because your mind is somewhere else. Your facial expression, if you're trying to figure out the grammar or the word or however you want to bring up the next topic, you might start making an anxious face. And what that tells the person you're talking to is something's happening. This person's losing interest, or why does that person look angry? So that's going to detract from the energy and the flow of the conversation. And this could be impactful in just a casual moment, but if you're in an important conversation, in a negotiation, in a meeting, this could actually be detrimental to the point of costing you money or a deal. So you're going to listen actively. When you have a thought, you're going to have the tools today. I'm going to teach you the transitional phrases that you need to smoothly navigate away from it. They're very tiny because it's meant to be simple, so it's effective. Now that you'll have the tools, you won't have to worry about the planning and you'll be able to listen actively. Now, I will give you an extra tip here because I find that certain cultures, I find this happens a lot more when I work with Eastern Europeans, like Russia, Germany. That doesn't mean that other countries don't do this, but I find that the way that you show that you're listening actively is you say, uh-huh. That's fine. And we do it too as Americans. But the trick is when. If you're saying, uh-huh, 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 all the time, you're thinking like, oh, I'm just showing them that I'm listening. But what it sounds like, it interrupts the thought process. And to an American, that sounds like you're trying to rush me, that you're not interested in what I'm saying, or you disagree and you're being dismissive. So that in combination with, for example, those particular cultures are also not usually as expressive or smiley. So when you have a serious face and you're saying, uh-huh, 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 it creates this energy where it's completely contrary to what you're trying to do, which is create an atmosphere where you show that you're listening. And instead, the feeling that you're causing is dismissiveness or like you're trying to move on. So if you're going to say, uh-huh, to show agreement or that you're listening actively, make sure you say it at the end of someone's sentence or thought, not in between everything they're saying. So when they're finished a sentence, then you can say, mm-hmm. Then it feels like you're listening. But when you interrupt it, it feels like you don't care. So that's the technique there. And I'll be honest, if you find that you can do this by recording yourself, or if you ever have virtual meetings, record it. You can analyze yourself. I have my clients do that so we can really go into a deep dive analysis. You're going to want to see if you overdo it. And if you do say uh-huh too much, just take away the verbal cue and just do the motion and add like mhm. Oh, okay. So vary it up, and that's going to feel a lot more natural and also allow the person to feel like you're genuinely listening. Now, for the transitional phrases, we're going to go over 4 today because that's all you need. Are there more? Sure. And once you learn these today, you're going to notice that we use them all the time. In fact, I remember this was a couple years ago when I was putting together, I noticed that this was like the missing piece for conversational English at an advanced level. And I sat at my friend's house and it was a bunch of us together. And I just sat quietly and observed. And knowing that these are the phrases I was going to recommend, I want to test it out. Of course, I want to make sure that I'm giving you the most authentic. The amount of times that we all used the phrases I'm going to teach you today is staggering. Like it's so ingrained in our conversational nuance that we don't even notice how much nobody taught us this either. It's just how Americans jump around in conversations. Now, the important thing is that you have to use transitional phrases because if you don't, and this is where the cultural nuance comes in. So when I'm working with clients from, I would say I see this a lot, especially from like Germany and Iceland and like the what I call the happy countries, because those cultures tend to be very direct. And let me know if this is something that you experience with you. Instead, they don't use, or you might not be using transitional phrases like the ones I'm going to teach you today. And so what happens is the perception of that is that you're disinterested and you're just moving something along. So you meet the goal of changing the subject, but unfortunately you have the negative side effect of making someone feel like you didn't care what they were talking about. And that feels really crappy if it's a friend or a colleague, but it's could be borderline offensive when we're talking about a board meeting or an important discussion. So that's what I mean that this is equally as important for casual as it is for high level business interactions. Okay, so the first two that I'm going to teach you, when you're going to change a subject to something that was mentioned, and then I'll teach you how to change a subject to something that is completely not part of what you're talking about. So the two expressions that Americans use the most are speaking of and that reminds me. And of course, intonation plays a big part in how to make this feel smooth because if you say it robotically, it's not going to have the same effect. So let's say someone's talking about what a beautiful day it is. You know, we love talking about the weather. It's like, "Oh, it's so nice out today." And that reminds you of something that you wanna change the subject to, but you don't wanna talk about the weather. You could say, "Oh, speaking of pretty weather, I'm planning to go to the beach next month. Have you ever been to Destin?" So that's what I mean by linking to something that's you're changing the subject, but it's still kind of related. You can connect it to something that was mentioned. Oh, what's another good example? For example, that reminds me if someone says, "Oh, my kids had a baseball game this weekend." I'm like, "Oh, baseball. That reminds me. Watched this movie about a all women's baseball team, and it was so good, but I can't think of the name. A League of Their Own." So there, you're the baseball, you might not want to keep talking about the person's kids, or maybe you do, but you just have a random thought that you want to share and verbalize. That's how you do it. So, speaking of, that reminds me of in a presentation. So, in a leadership capacity, when you're in a meeting and you want to make sure there's a point, something that came up that you want to mention. Let's say we're talking about, I usually bring up the example of quarterly projections. And you're like, oh, speaking of quarterly projections, let's go back to the production for last quarter. I have another thing I want to talk about there. So, there, instead of just saying, I want to talk about last quarter's projections, or I want to talk about last quarter production, what you're doing there is not only are you, yes, you're changing the subject, but if you don't use a transitional expression, it's not smooth and it creates this energy that's negative. And so, you, from a leadership position and your executive presence, you're not making the presenter feel good, which trickles down to everybody else in the meeting. They're going to feel a little more tense with you. And so, this is going to help you just navigate the situations so smoothly, which my goal always with teaching leadership English is you're doing it not only to sound better and to communicate more effectively, but you're also doing it to create a safe, productive environment. So, again, speaking of, and that reminds me, go to Youglish, which is a website that I love because it pulls YouTube clips. Put speaking of and watch how often we use it. It's awesome. Next time you watch a show on Netflix, next time you listen to a podcast, especially when it's two people talking to each other, it's amazing how often this comes up. But there's more to the strategy. To really elevate your conversational skills, and with Americans, this is really important. It's not just about changing the subject with a transitional expression. That's amazing. That's already going to level up your smoothness, if you will. But you also want to acknowledge what was said. So this is going to help you feel or be perceived less rude. Because when you just change the subject sharply, the perception is going to be this person is rude or abrasive or dismissive. So the formula that we use, or that I always coach, is acknowledge what was said, transitional expression, and then your point. So, for example, back to the weather one. Oh, the weather's so beautiful today. Acknowledge what was said. Yeah, it's really nice outside. Transitional expression. Speaking of good weather, personal connection or the subject change. I'm going to the beach next weekend. Have you been to Destin? So that formula, it's so simple, but when you implement that and it becomes ingrained in you, your level of connection is, it's not that speaking like a native speaker is the goal, because I even coach native speakers on how to do this better. It's about that next level connection. It's being natural. And so many of you, you're so comfortable doing that in your native language, especially my clients. And if you're in this position as well, once you reach leadership positions, you're there because you're good at this on some level. So by elevating this, the way you're going to be able to grow your network, the way you're going to be able to increase your impact is amazing. And as you see, it's pretty simple, but simple does not mean easy. So it does take a lot of practice. Now, when you want to change a subject, but not something related, these are the two phrases that we use: unrelated, but on a different note. And you're not going to say it like that because that sounds robotic. So I recommend elongate unrelated, because you want to signal to the person like, I'm interrupting your thought. I'm changing the subject, and I don't mean to be rude, but it's going to be about something different. You can say all of that just by saying this slowly. Unrelated, but simple. On a different note, now just using the transitional expression is good, but not good enough. What makes it great is acknowledgement. So, what we just talked about. So, for example, if the person says the weather, oh, it's such a beautiful day outside, acknowledge, yeah, it's really nice outside. Transitional expression. On a different note, and then your change of subject. Do you have a report from our client? If the person says it's so nice outside and you just say, "Do you have the report from our client?" That person's gonna no, that's gonna make it. And I know in your mind, especially if you come from a culture that's very direct, or you're nervous about your English and you're just trying not to speak too much. But I find this happens most with cultures that are very direct. I know you're just trying to get to the point, and in your mind, that's the most efficient way. But The thing about communication is efficiency, effectiveness also incorporates cultural nuance. It's not just about, to use an American expression, the bottom line. It's about how you get to the bottom line. So this is really important. So on a different note, for example, or what did we just use? Yeah. So we can say unrelated. If we're talking about, let's say your colleagues telling you what they did this weekend, the same example we had before, like, oh yeah, I took my kids to a baseball game. Acknowledge what they said. Oh, cool. Baseball games are so fun. Transitional expression. Unrelated, but, and then change the subject. I'm planning a vacation. Do you have any good beach spots that you recommend? If the person says, I took my kids to a baseball game, and you reply with, I'm planning a vacation. Do you have any recommendations? They're going to look at you like, this person only cares about themselves. Like they don't even care what I'm saying. And that's not how you make genuine connections, by making people feel like you don't care. And look, maybe you don't care about their kids. Maybe you don't care about baseball, but you do care about connections and about making people feel valid. And at the end of the day, that's the goal. So if you feel defensive and you're like, no, I'm being direct, I'm being honest and authentic, I don't care about their kids or baseball, and I'm just going to move on. That's not a great energy to bring. And it's not going to create a connection that's going to be beneficial for you. So, whether your intention is to be more efficient for work or to make genuine connections with people, either way, this is the process. And again, grammatically, it's really simple. And you've got your formula: acknowledge, transition, move on. I'll have to think of a cooler way to package that. But that's it, those 3 steps. And then you have 4 expressions. This will take your conversation skills to the next level. And it's so simple, but it's not easy. So you have to practice. It's worth it. Now, the next tip I have for being able to, we'll add a 4th step to the formula. And this mostly applies to if it's conversational. If you're changing the subject during a meeting and it's something very specific, you might not need this 4th step, but it's good to know. Ask questions. This is really important with American conversation. And I know we've talked about this in a few of our other lives. American conversation is, if you think about the rhythm, like tennis, back and forth, back and forth. Whereas some cultures are really direct to the point. There's not a lot of elaboration. Other cultures, you're used to just talking, 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 because you assume if someone wants to contribute or say anything, they'll just interrupt. But Americans don't do that. So a way to keep the other person engaged, because I want you to feel empowered to engage them. So it's not just, because what I find, but when I'm working with my clients, is they're like, okay, I feel like all the conversations are really short and superficial, and they think it's an American thing. That's how we start. But if you want to make longer conversations, get to know people, talk about deeper topics, this is the missing piece. This is the part where you might think like they don't care, they don't talk about anything serious. It's because you're probably not engaging in a way that makes them feel they can. So, by asking questions, you keep the conversation going. Even the example we had before, the person's talking about their kids in a baseball game and you acknowledge them. Oh, cool. That must have been so fun. Transition. On a different note, your change of the subject. I'm planning a vacation. Do you have any good beaches that you recommend? And that's the question. So I'm planning a vacation. And the question, you could just say on a different note, I'm planning a vacation and I'm so excited to go to the beach. But then that doesn't leave room for continuance. So asking a question re engages the person and then you're able to move on. So this is really important, especially if you're frustrated that things keep staying at a superficial point. So this is going to make you feel, oh, the conversations are just so much richer. They're so much more enjoyable. And when you have to have serious conversations, you can also navigate that. So this is where I encourage you, implement these skills and implement these tactics in casual conversation, because then when you need them, for example, if you're having an annual review and you have some tough conversations to have, you're one-on-one with your team, when you have to talk to the board and maybe the company didn't do very well that quarter. When you have to navigate those more difficult conversations, if you're able to use these strategies with the casual and the positive, You'll then feel more comfortable navigating more high pressure situations. And as a leader, as a professional, that's very important. You want to feel confident, have that executive presence. You want to make sure people feel good in your under your leadership. And the way that you do that is you're able to navigate conversations smoothly. Okay. So now you know how to change the subject with confidence, and not only with confidence, but you also have the formula to do it in a way that's easy to implement. And I'm going to put some notes together. I'll write the formula down for you. So I'll post the notes in the comments so that you can review this and practice, practice, practice. And if you're interested in one-on-one coaching, I have a leadership communication program. This is great if you're in a situation where you're either an established leader, but now you're working in English, or if you just got a promotion and you want to make sure that your leadership communication in English is confident and strong. This is the program for you. Thank you so much for joining me. Make sure to download your free audio training, The Three Essentials of American Leadership Communication. Keep letting me know in the comments what topics are interesting to you, what are your experiences at work, and how I can best create content that helps you. See you next time.